Who was the weakest link in the band Kiss? Well, let's talk about it. So, in any really good band or any really accomplished band, especially a legendary band, there is no weakest link. You can say that about bands like the Beatles, you can say that about Queen, you can say that about Rush, you can say that about Metallica, but the whole point of this game is that you take a very strong band that may or may not have an actual weak link, and you're forced to choose one anyway. I say this because a lot of people have been leaving comments saying there is no weak link on the weakest link band videos. Alright, so with this one, with Kiss, it's similar in my opinion to the situation with Motley Crue, where you could make a case for any one of the members being the weakest link. This is a purely musical observation. It has nothing to do with who might be the business genius in the band or who was the one who came up with this idea or that idea. So let's go member by member through Kiss and decide if we can determine a weakest link. Let's start with Gene Simmons. Gene is a more than competent bass player. He is a strong songwriter, particularly in the early days of Kiss, and he's well known as being the creative mastermind along with Paul Stanley behind the entire concept of the band, both musically and in terms of its image. So he's going to be tough to replace, but I would say not impossible. And the reason that I would say not impossible is because yes, Gene Simmons wrote a lot of important songs in the early days, but the songs that he wrote, like Nothing to Lose or Deuce, are fairly standard straight ahead riff rock that the band could have compensated for with other material or found another player to contribute equally as aggressive kind of rock riffs. They're pretty generic. They're not Tony Iommi level. They're not groundbreaking. So let's leave Gene Simmons in the running for now. Let's also take just a minute to talk about his singing. He's not the world's greatest lead vocalist, but he's a great harmony vocalist, and he has a strong character in the band, the Demon, which he fully embodies, and that makes up for a lot of the perhaps musical deficiencies that he may have. Alright, so let's move on to Paul Stanley. If Kiss has anything that could be considered a leader or a lead singer, it's Paul Stanley. He's most often the one who interacts with the crowd. He's the face of the band when they're on stage in terms of where his microphone is placed, is at the center of the stage, and he conducts himself like he's the band leader, whether this is the case or not. And there was a period in the 80s and 90s where the band largely fell into his hands. He is the foremost songwriter in the band in terms of both music and lyrics, and he not only writes songs that you would expect, like I Was Made for Loving You, but he writes songs that you might not expect were his, like God of Thunder. So he has a great versatility as a songwriter. He may not be a great guitar player, but at one time he was a very competent arena level, stadium level lead vocalist. Alright, let's move on to Peter Criss. I've done an entire video on Peter Criss's drumming, and in that video I made it clear that I thought that he was a more than adequate drummer for the band, and that a lot of the hate that he gets about being incompetent, not being able to count, not understanding music, just a lot of garbage. If you go back and listen to the live performances and the studio records, at one time he was a very good drummer, and because he plays slightly ahead of the beat and he comes out of a jazz tradition, gives his drumming a unique character. There's another aspect here that we have to consider, which is his vocal. Peter Criss is arguably the best singer in Kiss, and their most important breakthrough song was a ballad, Beth, that he both co-wrote and sang. So his vocals and his drumming, both musical aspects, are really important in the band, as well as his Catman image. Let's move on to Ace. Ace Frehley is often cited as the best musician, and this could have been true at certain points, might have not been true at others. He's definitely the one who is the most traditionally rock and roll of the four. He is the one you're most likely to get your standard, Pete Townsend, Jimi Hendrix, Jimmy Page, this type of thing. He hasn't moved over into Motown like Paul Stanley, or, vaudeville type things like Gene Simmons, or jazz like Peter Criss. And for this, he deserves a lot of credit. The other factor in his playing and his involvement in the band is, of course, his soloing. His solos are well known for being hummable, for having a lot of melody, for being songs within the songs. They're really catchy, they're inventive, and I don't think there's another player that could pull that off the same exact way that he does. They just don't exist. In all the time that there have been, shredders and virtuosos and your Eddie Van Halens and Jimi Hendrix, but Ace really carved out a place for himself as just sort of like the greatest pop guitar soloist in a rock band that ever lived. Alright, so we've briefly summed up each one of the members, and now it's time to narrow it down. I would say that for all of his faults as a musician, you really can't have Kiss without Paul Stanley, because he was such a huge songwriter for the band, and he was the frontman for the band, and he took sole creative control over the band for so long that I just don't think you can do Kiss without Paul. So Paul Stanley for me is not the weakest link in Kiss. Moving on to Gene Simmons. Well, again, he maybe isn't the greatest musician in the world, and he has a lot of limitations so far as songwriting goes, but he did write some good songs. And in the 70s in particular, he was willing to take the music into some really interesting, darker areas, experimental areas. And he was also very reliable, and you need a pillar of stability in that band, and between him and Paul Stanley you have that. So I don't think that you can consider Gene Simmons the weakest link in the band. That leaves us with Ace and Peter, and here we get a really interesting comparison, because we've seen the band without them, and it's not nearly as exciting when you lose either one of the two. But we had the opportunity to hear what Kiss sounded like when they just didn't have Ace, and I'm not talking about the non-live side of Kiss Alive 2, where Ace didn't play, or a track like Flamin' Youth, where even though he was a co-writer, he opted out of the session in the studio. And what you hear there with one of the Kulicks, or another guitarist that steps in and plays for Ace, is that Kiss does lose a level of excitement, but it's not a seismic enough occurrence to wipe them off the map. So if Ace would have quit the band in the early 70s and they replaced him with another guitar player, put him in makeup, and compensated for it, I think they would have done okay. They would have been missing a few great songs, but at the same time he didn't write enough songs to tip the balance. So we'll move on to Peter. I think that without Peter Criss, unfortunately for everybody, Kiss would have wound up, they would have finished it up around the time of Destroyer. Without Beth, without that breakthrough single to follow up Kiss Alive, they would have faded from memory immediately. They would have been known as a novelty band that spit blood, stuck their tongue out at the cameras and all that. What kept them in the public eye and translated them to this big popular sensation was the breakout success of Beth. And Beth could not have been sung and been as an effective of a song if it was done by Paul Stanley. It certainly couldn't have been sung by Gene Simmons. It certainly couldn't have been sung by Ace. Now, personally, I don't care for the song myself. I never did. And I don't think it's a great song, but I think that it was massively important in making Kiss what they are. I also think that it put a stake in their heart because it caused Peter Criss's ego to grow out of control, disproportionate to his actual musical influence in the band. But despite this fact, I'm still not going to call him the weakest link. I think Kiss with another drummer is going to be too plodding. They might be better technically, but it's going to suck a lot of the fun and swing and party element out of the band, as I've mentioned before, which is exactly what you get when you get a great drummer in there like Eric Carr. You get a much better drummer, but you get a way less interesting band. So this leads me to the sad conclusion that it's Ace that's actually the weakest link in the original Kiss, simply because his vocals are good, but they're not great. His guitar playing is stellar. It's one of a kind, but you don't need it to make the band successful. People weren't tuning in to listen to the guitar solos. Guitarists were tuning in to listen to the guitar solos, but the public at large were tuning in to see the spectacle and hear the band. And I think that you could possibly lose Ace and still retain most of what made Kiss memorable. Of course, it's never going to be as good as with Ace, and this is not to say that Ace alone, like on his 78 solo album, isn't better than Kiss in some ways. What I'm saying is that Kiss could have survived the loss of Ace easier than the loss of any other single member. That's what I think. If you have a thought on this or any other issue connected to classic or contemporary music, please comment in the section below. Remember to like and subscribe. Thanks a lot. Music Guru here, asking you to help us on our march to 10,000 subscribers.